Hey YouTube, Sergeant Savinelli. Well, I finally found the time. So here we are, and welcome to part one of Cigars and Tobacco, a Connecticut story. So, if you ask people about cigar tobacco and production of, production and growth of cigar tobacco, right away what comes to mind is Cuba, Dominican Republic, places like that, Honduras. Very few uninitiated people are aware that one of the most sought after uh, cigar wrappers is actually grown right here in the late great state of Connecticut. I call it the late great state of Connecticut because at one time it was a super great state before the politicians got involved and screwed it all up. No, I'm not going to go into a political tirade. I don't do those. Just a little bit of history, that's all. So, Connecticut, and bear with me because I'm actually going to read some of this stuff because it's impossible to remember all of the dates and things. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of read lecture. So, don't fall asleep on me, huh? So, the tobacco leaves that are grown in Connecticut here, they're like the cigar industry's most sought after leaf, next to the Cuban stuff. I mean, we're right there neck and neck. As a matter of fact, there's an old saying that if you wanted to make a Cuban cigar better, wrap it with a Connecticut shade wrapper. And at one time, long before all of the insanity of the revolution and the embargo and so forth, there were actually some Cuban cigars that were wrapped in Connecticut shade wrapper. Surprise, surprise. Likewise, cigars that were made here in Connecticut also had Cuban filler at that time. We'll get into more of that. I guess a little housekeeping is in order too. Not just with pipes, but with cigars too. So today, I am smoking a Perdomo 20th anniversary edition. It's a beautiful, beautiful cigar. It's not this is actually wrapped in Ecuadorian Connecticut, right? Because now Connecticut wrapper is actually sold or actually grown overseas in some hotter climates. So, Connecticut shade tobacco. We have a region here in Connecticut that runs from the capital city of Hartford north to Massachusetts, known as the Connecticut River Valley. The soil there is so rich and it's of a consistency and a makeup that exists nowhere else in the state. Kind of like Cuba, there's a specific place where their tobacco is grown, their best tobacco is grown for their best cigars. No different here. The richness of the soil was sought after by, all kinds of people trying to replicate it and duplicate it. You can only get just so close. Shade tobacco is grown under these tents. And it's funny because they still grow it up there, and not to the extent that they once did. But you go up there along I-91 in the Windsor area, all the way up through Enfield and right through Massachusetts, right through the state line. You could actually see the tents. And basically it's like white cloth that's built up onto these frames, and the tobacco is grown underneath there to shade it from the sun. And what that does is it basically produces, with the shade and the soil composition, it actually produces a very elastic, very silky, very even colored, fine broadleaf wrapper, which is like no other. So, let's see here. I have to put my cheaters on. Now I can see. So let's see here. Getting into the actual history of it. At one time, the state of Connecticut had about 35,000 acres of tobacco fields. At one time, it was one of Connecticut's biggest, if not the biggest, export product that we had, making a ton of money. It started like in the 1630s, back when the first settlers came to the Connecticut River Valley, and the Native Americans of the area were already growing tobacco, and they pretty much taught the newcomers how to do that. The town of Windsor became the epicenter of the tobacco industry here in Connecticut. The town was founded in 1633, and within 7 years it was producing tobacco for personal use and for profit. They figured, they found that they can sell it and trade with it and so forth. Originally, the tobacco being grown there was for pipe use. They brought the seeds up from Virginia, and the reason they did this was because the Connecticut variety of tobacco that they were growing wasn't as delicious as the Virginia style. So eventually cigars took over, and they became a lot more popular than the pipe did, especially during the Civil War era. The big broadleaf that they were growing, it was in such high demand during the Civil War that Connecticut was actually growing 10 million pounds a year. That's 10 million pounds a year. And then word of mouth across the country, people were raving about the quality of the Connecticut tobacco and the wrappers and so forth and so on. So then they started sometime around 1700 to export it by way of the Connecticut River out to the sea, and they would go to European ports. And the use of Connecticut Valley tobacco as cigar wrappers started in the 1820s. Area farmers grew the tobacco for the two outside layers of the cigars, binder and wrapper. And by the 1830s, tobacco farmers were experimenting with different types of seeds and processing techniques and so forth and so on. And then they started farting around in 1875 with the Habana seed and growing it here. We had a real good relationship with Cuba at one time. So what finally developed into the Connecticut shade wrapper was a fine Sumatra from overseas. Those were the seeds that they planted, and that Sumatra wrapper, or Sumatra tobacco, was what eventually became the Connecticut shade leaf, the Connecticut shade wrapper, because they started growing it under the tents, and they found that it was just absolutely phenomenal. So these techniques are still kept, to this day. Like I said, if you drive by there now, you can see the tents. Not as many as there were, and in the old tobacco barns. Some of them are still standing. Some of them are just, dilapidated because no use. So 1920 was when Prohibition took over. And, you couldn't buy booze, you couldn't sell booze, you couldn't have booze, you couldn't do anything with it. It was the time of the Untouchables and Al Capone and all of those people, right? Elliot Ness. Connecticut was no different. You couldn't buy or sell booze here either because it was countrywide. Tobacco production peaked in Connecticut as a result because people were smoking more because they couldn't drink as much. They were still finding ways to get it. Bathtub gin was born and so forth and so on. So the way the shade tobacco works is growing it under the tents. The sunlight is softened and diffused to the point where it's indirect. It's no longer beating directly in, broad daylight. It's filtered by these tent cloths, by the material. The air is made more humid underneath those tents, obviously, because the airflow isn't going through wide open. There's a covering. And the ambient temperature underneath is slightly warmer than it is outside, so you're getting a good grow temperature. Cuban and Dominican cigar producers at that time were going crazy for Connecticut shade wrapper. It was thinner, it was elastic. You could roll a cigar without having to worry about it break. The leaves were large enough to roll cigars practically seamless. And the even color was a big thing. When you open a box of cigars and you see all the cigars almost the same color. I mean, obvious variations because, you know, leaf is what it is. It's imperfect to begin with. But even colored, beautiful, nice, smooth, silky, everything was the same. That was highly sought after by the Cubans and the Dominicans. And incidentally, the Dominicans rolled cigars long before anybody else on this planet. The Dominicans, I believe, started the whole cigar making thing long before the Cubans, long before us. I don't know what the year was. Well, we went from, unfortunately, 34,000 acres at one time to just about 2,000 acres today. It's a big cut, huge cut. To the point that one of the biggest cigar companies, Altadis, actually bought one of the farms so that they would have a steady supply of Connecticut shade wrapper for their own production, all right, of the brands. Monte Cristo, that's one of their brands. Non-Cuban Monte Cristos. Altadis owns that name, the non-Cuban version. So those are wrapped with Connecticut wrappers. If you've ever seen one or smoked one, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So just a little bit on how cigars are made with the tobacco that they use. Bear with me, I don't want this thing to go out. It's so good. All right, the tobacco plant. The tobacco plant is comprised of basically like three levels, three sections. You got your top leaves, you got your middle leaf on the plant, and you got your lower bottom leaves. So the very top leaf is known as ligero, right? It's pronounced ligero. It's spelled ligero, Ligero. Those are your top leaves. Ligero leaves are where the strength of the cigar comes from. All right, ligero, it gives it the power. Whether you want a mild cigar or you want a full-bodied cigar, something that's going to knock you on your butt, that's where ligero comes in. The ligero leaf guides the strength of the cigar. Towards the middle, you have the seco leaves. The seco leaves are for the aroma of the cigar. The smell, depending on the blend, you know, a little more of this, a little less of that. No different than pipe tobacco, same thing. There's blends. So the seco, the middle leaf is the seco. That's for the aroma, and the leaves that grow at the bottom of the plant are called volado. All right, the volado leaves are for the combustion of the cigar, how it's going to burn, and then you've got the binder leaves. All right, generally a good cigar is rolled with 2 binder leaves. So you've got your bunched blend, you've got your 2 binder leaves that actually bind the cigar. That's your first rolling, okay? And then once those are rolled, and you know, some people they press them, some they don't. Once those are rolled, then they're ready for the wrapper. And then that's where the Connecticut shade wrapper comes in, and it wraps the outside. Now the wrapper is more for the looks. It was kind of compared to the dress that a woman would wear. You know, somebody once said like the mink coat on Sophia Loren. We'll talk more about that. I've got to clip it here because we're running into the 15-minute mark and I don't want to have to redo this one.